Continuing our discussion of extroversion, another interesting finding from the literature about extroversion is relative to introverts. Extroverts show superior ability to recognize faces. So, if you bring extroverts into your lab and you show them a group of photos of people's faces, and then you later show them a second group of faces, some of which were in the original group and others not, so some new faces and some old faces, and ask them which of these individuals were in the original group of faces that they saw. Extroverts perform better at this task than introverts do. But interestingly, not better at recognizing non-social stimuli, such as flowers. So it's not that they have better memory in general, but they have better memory for faces. So, and this is actually makes sense. And given that extroverts are more sociable, they spend more time around people, they enjoy spending time around people. And by the way, memory to some extent is going to be impacted by your interest in what you're doing. This is why I always encourage students to try to enjoy the class they're in rather than simply focusing on their grade. Okay, if you enjoy what you're doing, you're going to remember it better. And extroverts enjoy meeting people. And this finding is directly tied to, in fact, the gregariousness facet of extroversion. As you know, there are multiple facets of extroversion, and they're not all equally linked to this ability. It's the gregariousness facet specifically that seems to be linked to this ability. And so, again, that's pretty much what, I mean, it's not surprising that basically people who are high in gregariousness spend time around a lot of people. They interact with a lot of people. And so they're just better. They have more experience recognizing people. Extroverts are also better at decoding nonverbal social information than introverts. So a lot of human communication is nonverbal. And extroverts are just much better at this than introverts are. When I think of this finding, I think of an episode of Big Bang Theory when Penny was on a date with the somewhat introverted, what's his name? The owner of the comic book store, Stuart. And they come home from their date, and Penny invites Stuart up to her apartment for quote unquote coffee. And Stuart looks at his watch and says, "Isn't it a little late for coffee?" And then Penny looks at him and says, "Oh, isn't that sweet? You think coffee's coffee." Well, introverts are much more likely to make that mistake than extroverts are. Extroverts are better at decoding nonverbal social information. Another characteristic of extroversion that is pretty important, it was most emphasized by Eysenck, is impulsivity. Extroverts have a harder time delaying gratification than introverts do. And we see this in, for example, in a procedure known as delay discounting. And this involves, delay discounting involves the fact that the longer the time period between the time someone is offered something and receives it, the less value it has. And so, in other words, the longer someone has to wait for something, the less value it has in the moment. And extroverts tend to do more of this than introverts. So, for example, if someone says, I will give you $5 right now, or $15 in 3 months, extroverts are more likely than introverts to take the $5 right now. They have a harder time delaying gratification. Extroverts are very much live in the moment. They are present oriented. They are not future oriented. Okay, this is why the extrovert is willing to go out and go to a party when there's an exam later in the week, okay? Because to them, the exam is 3 days from now, and I can party tonight. So what's happening today always takes precedence over what's happening down the road for an extrovert. Okay, whereas an introvert is more likely to, an introvert is much better able to delay gratification. And consistent with this, extroverts are more likely to gamble, drink, and use recreational drugs, and have more sex with more partners than introverts. And so, again, it's literally eat, drink, and be merry, as the saying goes. That's the kind of the model of life for the extrovert. Eat, drink, and be merry. And so tomorrow is tomorrow. Interestingly, they're more likely to talk about sex. They're not just more likely to do it, but they actually talk about it more, for what that's worth. And there's also more to this, which we'll talk about more when we get to the biology section. But you know, they're also sensation seekers. So there are really two things operating here. They have problems delaying gratification. They're impulsive, but they're also sensation seeking, and that's actually part of one of the facets of extroversion. So high sensation seekers want stimulation. You know, all those things are exciting. Gambling is exciting. In fact, they call, for example, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but the Kentucky Derby is the nickname for the Kentucky Derby is the most exciting 2 minutes in sports. There's something about gambling that is exciting, and I'm not sure, people who haven't done it may not realize it, but there's a lot of people who gamble feel a lot of excitement from it. Drinking, of course, is stimulating. Sex and so on. These are all forms of stimulation, and that's part of what motivates the extrovert. Another thing along the same lines, extroverts experience most stimuli as more rewarding than introverts, and this is called reward sensitivity. And some people believe this and this is actually pretty recent research, the last few years. Many people believe that this may lie at the heart of the trait, that it's really all about reward sensitivity. I mean, so the idea, the reason extroverts do all of these things that are pleasurable is because they're more sensitive to reward. And there's no question that these are sensation seeking people, and they are reward driven. Um, just as uh, people high in neuroticism are punishment driven. People high in extrovert, and again, this is going to be connected to the positive affect and the negative affect. When people feel good, one of the things that's connected to extroversion, which I haven't mentioned, is optimism. These are optimistic people, and that's part of, not only do they feel good emotionally, but cognitively they're optimistic. And so this characteristic leads them to, they expect positive things to happen, and they're this, the way they're wired up, they seek reward, and there's no question about that. And so again, which is the opposite of what we see with people who are high in neuroticism, who are motivated primarily to avoid punishment. People high in neuroticism are always worried that something bad is going to happen. And that's what motivates them, is avoiding bad things. With extroverts, the motivation is seeking out reinforcement. And that's what they do. And so, according to this view, extroverts may be drawn to social situations, not so much because they're sociable, but because they're more sensitive to rewards involved in these situations. So if you go to a party, they're going to be, there's going to be alcohol, and there's going to be potential sex partners, and there's going to be, all of these things, that are rewarding to them, that are reinforcing to them. And certainly that's part of it. I mean, this theory is still, as I said, relatively new, but clearly there is more to it. I mean, regardless of how you want to frame it, whether you want to frame it in terms of reward sensitivity or sensation seeking, there's certainly more to it than just they like people. It's definitely much broader than that. It's not simply they like people, and honestly, I think that aspect of the trait has probably been overblown to some extent. As we've discussed, there are other aspects of this: the positive affect, the sensation seeking, all of these other things are every bit as important as wanting to be around people. I mean, again, they want to be around people, but there are, again, all of this is about what you see here, that last line there on the first bullet, what lies at the heart of the trait. All of these things are part of the concept of extroversion. The debate is over what's the central component of it. What lies at the heart of this trait? And the verdict is still out on that. Extroversion, in terms of motives, what motivates them, it is related to, people who score high in extroversion have more, are driven more by economic status, political status, and hedonism, as we've discussed, than our other people. So in terms of goals, these are what motivates them. No surprises. They are. Everything here makes perfect sense in terms of what we've discussed with extroverts. All of these things involve. These are all relational. Status, that's relational. They want to be, again, the life of the party. Political, influencing and leading, again, that social ascendance. And hedonistic, again, the pleasure and we just talked about all of those things. These are the things that motivate extroverts. In terms of their sort of long-term outcomes or correlates, extroverts tend to be popular and often emerge as leaders. So we saw on the previous slide, that's what they're motivated in that direction. Socially, politically, they want to be kind of take the lead, and they do. They often do. As they go through life, they often do emerge as leaders. They gravitate towards sales positions and other jobs that require a lot of social interaction. So, if you're extrovert, you know that these are positions you're going to excel in. And so they, once they graduate college, they go out into the workforce, they tend to end up in these kinds of positions, those that involve a lot of interaction with other people. And sales is kind of the perfect job for them. Although there are lots of other positions that involve these skills. Politics, as we mentioned, being a talk show host, if you can find something like that, those are pretty hard to come by. But anything that involves interacting with other people, they tend to excel at. They don't do so well in solitary jobs. That they tend to struggle with more. Although they're motivated by wealth and money, they're more likely than introverts to end up in debt. And so financially, extroverts, although they're often successful in jobs, they're more likely to end up in debt, and you can see why. As we've discussed, they don't really think about, they're not future oriented. They're focused on today. And so that mentality is more likely to lead you into debt than someone who is saving for tomorrow or investing for tomorrow. And so that present orientation can sometimes come back to bite them. And they also tend to have more expensive tastes than introverts do. Although, because of electronics and all of that, I guess introvert tastes are getting more expensive. But, historically, introverts would read a book. They're pretty much happy, reading a book. And books aren't, well, actually, again, these things evolve. The cost of these things evolve. There was a time where books were extremely expensive. If you go back before the printing press, because they had to be written, transcribed by hand. And so books actually were quite expensive at one point, and then they got cheaper after the printing press. And, today with, a lot of the electronics and so forth, gadgets can be quite expensive. And, sometimes introverts these days will spend their time, on the computer or playing video games or doing things like that. I guess my point is introverts are generally less concerned with the latest designer pocketbook or whatever that can cost a lot of money. Introverts are less concerned with keeping up with the Joneses. So they just don't care so much about status. In fact, we go back to the previous slide, status is something that's much more extroversion than introversion. Extroverts do not perform as well academically as introverts. And introverts are tend to be slightly brighter, and they make better grades. And the fact that introverts perform better academically should not be a surprise to anyone, given that introverts are studying while extroverts are socializing. So that's really not a surprise. But they are, on average, slightly brighter, and they certainly perform better academically than extroverts do. We've talked a lot about people on the high end, so I want to spend at least a moment talking about people on the low end. Obviously, people on the low end of this trait, who we commonly refer to as introverts, prefer quiet and solitude to noise and crowds. They prefer to be alone, sit quietly, as I said, read a book. They would prefer a bookstore or a quiet coffee shop to a fraternity party. They tend to be easily overwhelmed by stimulation, whereas the extrovert is sensation seeking. The introvert is kind of stimulus shy. They don't want a lot of that stimulation. Introverts are less comfortable around people they don't know, and they do not make friends easily. They're more comfortable around family and friends. They feel drained if they have to spend too much time around other people. Whereas extroverts are energized by people and noise and all of that. Introverts are exhausted by it. When introverts, they need downtime. They need time to themselves, away from other people. And it's not a rejection of the other person. It's just the way they're made. They can't handle being around a lot of people. It drains them. Whereas introverts are energized by it. Extroverts are overwhelmed by it, and they have to escape it. This doesn't mean, though, that they don't like other people or that they aren't good friends. On the contrary, introverts make great friends. They're good listeners. Extroverts, not so much. Extroverts like to talk more than they like to listen. Introverts like to listen more than talk. And so they are, good listeners, very supportive. Extroverts have a lot of acquaintances, but introverts have very strong, close relationships. Which is not to say extroverts can't. But, introverts are capable of giving more of themselves in a sense, even though they like their downtime. When they are with you, they're with you. And again, they're attentive. Extroverts are more distracted, and they're bouncing from one thing to another and one person to another. And, they're not as good at, again, they're more into talking than listening. And as we've already kind of touched on with my story about Penny and Stewart, introverts are less capable of extracting relevant social, emotional, and cues from their environment. So they're just not as good at picking up on social cues as extroverts. Now, one thing I should mention is I've discussed these characteristics of extroverts. They may seem a little extreme, because I'm describing the most, basically the most extreme variant. But as we've discussed, with all of these personality traits, it's on a continuum from the most introverted to the most extroverted, and most people do not fall at either of those extremes. Most people fall somewhat in the middle. So relatively few people are extremely extroverted who are going to have every single one of the characteristics that I described. Again, there are facets. You can be higher on some facets, lower on other facets. Um, Most people tend to fall somewhere in the middle because it's normally distributed, and most people can be both introverted and extroverted depending on the circumstances. Another point I want to make is that overall, neither end of the continuum is superior to the other. Although there's not much question that extroversion is more socially desirable than introversion, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. And so while the person high in extroversion might be more popular and in some ways may get more opportunities, not only socially but professionally, they're also more likely to, as we said, they're more likely to be in debt. They're more likely to die from risky behavior. They engage in more risks in life, and they're more likely to have problems as a result of their behavior. And so, gambling, for example, they can end up losing a lot of money, those kind of things. So it's not that, despite the sort of social desirability factor, overall, neither end of the continuum is really superior than the other. It's really about finding the right fit for one's personality, finding the right job, finding the right mate. It's just finding the right place to live. That's what it's about, and that, by the way, is why it's helpful to take courses like this. And I'm going to, I'll be posting an announcement about you taking some tests here, so you can actually find out a little bit about your own personality. Okay, we're going to stop there, and we will talk about agreeableness next time.